Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea. My name is Noelle Boc and I am the library director here in Danvers, but I am also the host of our brand new show in which we will be interviewing authors. So today is our very first show and our very first guest is Gail Brenner Nastasia, and she wrote the book The Fruit You'll Never See, which is a memoir about her life, and we're just going to have a talk about it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming today. It's a very rainy day.
Oh, I know.
So my first question I was going to have was what inspired you to write down all of this about your life?
I wouldn't actually call it inspiration. So I had experienced a death. I know you read the book. Mm-hmm. And I wrote, it was cathartic. It was really just a way for me to survive, because at that time I was so devastated that I couldn't imagine a world without, it was my boyfriend at the time, Jack. Mm-hmm. I couldn't imagine a world without him in it, and I couldn't imagine getting through the next day. And somebody had given me a at the time it was a word processor. I picked it up and next thing you know, I have this writing, and I didn't intend for it to be a book. It was kind of like a journal or a diary, or again, some way to function in the world. And I wrote and wrote and wrote, and then I put it away for a long time, but I did other things, and then got back to it later on in life. So
did you do any writing at all when you were young? But no, or not
I tried. My mother was also a writer, but she, same thing, she had addiction, so she was, I guess, stunted. You would say that it's what happens when people have addiction. So we, like her, I had the desire to write, and I had things to say inside of me, but I didn't know how to get them out. I hear people talk about writing from a really young age, and I didn't have the wherewithal. I had other important things to worry about.
Right,
and again,
yes.
You read the book, so you know that.
Right, you're just surviving.
Exactly. And I I wanted to, and I wonder about that sometimes, not often, because I don't like to go into what ifs, but what my life would have been like had those things been fostered, because I can write. I know now.
Right,
I didn't know for a really long time. I thought I just wasn't equipped, in the ways that other people were.
Yeah. I know. I think it's really interesting in the book, not to spoil it for anybody, but we won't spoil it.
Here I am. There's the spoiler.
Spoiler alert. So you talk only a little bit about your education. You don't get into it too much in your book, but how much you missed, basically, of you go to school, then you're not in school, then you're back in school, in and out. And I almost was surprised. Not surprised, but just that, at the end, suddenly you're like, oh, you're in law school and you're becoming a lawyer. So how did you get to that point of being able to go from having a very spotty educational background to being where you are now? You're a lawyer, sworn in.
And I think I'm somewhat of an anomaly. Although I do think that the option is available to everybody. I don't like to say that, though, because I know that I had an exorbitant amount of drive. I had this drive from a very, very young age. I mean, in the book, I talk about when I was 10, I would write down words from the dictionary and the meanings, because I wanted to learn. I just had this thirst for knowledge. So that is, huge in terms of how I got to where I am. But another side to that is that it was kind of an addiction for me. It was one of those things that. And I don't really like to use the word addiction, because it was a good thing, but it was my way to be a part of the world, to be like everybody else, to try and fit, and it worked for a really long time, which is, in my lawyering, I'm still a lawyer, I still practice law, but it gave me credibility in a way that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So in the writing of the book, I'm a believer now that my education was necessary for this to come out into the world. Because I think, had I not been in this position, it would have had a whole different meaning. This freedom from shame, because, and I said somewhere, and I'm not really sure where, but is out in the world to everybody, to the people I work
Right.
with, to judges, to
Right.
other lawyers, to, the district attorney. Like, it's a whole different response than I would have gotten otherwise. I've seen other people write books that aren't in the same position. So in terms of credibility, and without getting too far out there, and as far as spirituality goes, but I think it was just necessary, that this drive was necessary for me to get this story out in the way that it has been.
And what kind of law have you been practicing?
Criminal defense.
Criminal defense, which
Yeah,
kind of assuming from it, which makes a lot of sense.
right. And I used to
Considering
say
all your
that,
background.
like, to people, I'll represent you someday. Like my ex-boyfriend, I
Right,
said to
yeah,
him,
yeah.
but I didn't necessarily believe it, although there must have been a part of me that did, at the
right?
same
Yeah,
time.
to get there,
right.
get there. When you were going back to school, was that just an automatic sort of like, I'm going to go towards law as opposed to any other kind of career?
No, it's so the way things happened. I had been going to AA meetings, and I knew there was a man who went to law school, and I knew him, and it just so happened that I decided to do this paralegal program. There was no.
You're like, law is what I've always wanted to do. or
No,
anything.
because there was nothing I always wanted to do. I didn't have that future mentality because I was so wrapped up in the day, just trying to make it through the day, that I didn't have this, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to have a white wedding. I just didn't,
Right,
I didn't have that mentality, which I think is probably unusual to people because most people do have future mentality,
right, there's something.
but I just didn't. I didn't have any concept of what that looked like. So I met him and Peter, and then when I finished, he was he was about a year into his practice, and I went to work for him.
Oh.
And I was with him for 9 years, and I was his paralegal for 9 years.
Oh.
So it was kind of, things happened in spite of me. I didn't have to plan anything. It kind of just, it was laid out. And that's why I say, when I talk about this spiritual idea about where I was supposed to be, just being kind of showing up and doing the next thing, and then, one thing led to the next.
And you walked through the door.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So when you were very young, before addiction and all the other things were taking hold, did you have any thoughts of what you wanted to be when you grew up?
No, it's the
nothing
same.
at all, really.
Because
Same thing, even when you're really young.
when you say,
when you're little, right? Some kids are like, I want to be a firefighter.
yeah, there was no
whatever.
real before addiction took hold, because my mother
Was always
right. I mean, as
always
far
in
back as I
with
can
Rose,
remember.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there was no before for me, at least. I mean, maybe I didn't know as much, but I knew something, and I think, that's one of the important things in this book.
right.
That everybody is affected in some way, and especially by the shame, because I don't know if I inherited my mother's shame, but I had it from when I was
Very young.
right.
Yeah.
So and I'm sure I had it because she had it, So it was kind of like this.
Right, you because you saw it.
Exactly.
And so you absorbed it too. I was going to talk about that a little bit. So I know, yes, on the little cover it says, memoir about overcoming shame. But if someone had just casually asked me, oh, what's the book about? I said, oh, it's about a woman who is overcoming drug addiction. And so, what's the difference to you about the overcoming shame part? Between I was saying, oh, she's overcoming drug addiction, as opposed to, oh, she's overcoming shame.
Well, because I overcame addiction. I still am in recovery.
Right.
I will always be in recovery.
Right, of
So
course,
I haven't overcome having alcoholism or addiction in my blood or in my whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But I've overcome this physical needing of it. I'm not in that anymore. But it took me years to overcome the shame. In fact, I would say that didn't happen until I published this book.
Really?
Or right before that, because even right before, I had these thoughts of, oh my God, all these people are gonna know these things, because I didn't broadcast these things. Even, I
why would
speak,
you? Right?
Right?
Why would
there's
you?
really no reason. And, I speak at AA meetings. I've gone, I've spoken in front of a lot of people. Some of these things I don't talk about because there's really no reason. It's not a part of my addiction necessarily, my history, some of
Right.
it maybe. But yeah, I didn't necessarily share it. So I was almost like, do I really want to do this? But the truth is that if I hadn't done that, then I couldn't really make that claim that I have overcome it, because that is the proof. That is not to other people, but to myself.
Right, right.
So, I mean, it took me, I'm 21 years clean and sober.
Yeah, wow, amazing.
And this book is, just out. So
Right, yeah, right. So yeah, 21 years later.
Exactly. It took me.
Right. Because you do talk about that a lot in the book, is, your feelings of kind of being an imposter, or like not me.
Right.
Even I thought that was actually one of the moments when you're getting sworn in, and you say you look around the room and you think, who am I, right? Like to be doing this. Do you feel like you're past that now?
Well,
I mean, with the book, has it gotten you to that point?
Yeah. Well, not even just the in writing it or in having it publicized, but in what people have brought to me since then, because what I know now is everybody feels like that.
Yes.
Or most people feel like that. And
Yep,
not
I feel
just
like that.
it's remarkable, and people couldn't. It's given people a vehicle to express that,
Right.
even if just to me. But that's kind of why I wrote it, because I wanted people to see, like, even this, even me in my position, and I say, position as an attorney, because it's a respected position and profession, and even me, I have this whole other life that people didn't know about, and still I am perfectly okay. I'm perfectly well and still respected in the world. I'm not.
Right.
People didn't look at me and say, "Oh, what I thought, that you're disgusting, or you're unworthy or unlovable." Like, it didn't happen that way.
Right.
People brought to me their things. Oh my God, I feel like that too, or this is what happened to me, and like, that's what I was hoping for when I wrote it.
Yeah, which, I mean, I do think having a book like yours, especially, it's nice when it's you're local and and people can reach out to you too. But just like that idea, that there's people overcoming things all of the time, and you can too, right? Like, it's that sort of hope that you can have reading someone else's story.
Absolutely.
And be able to identify with pieces of it yourself. And I mean, I'm sure lots of people have had similar things, in their lives that they...
Well, and it's not real. Like, the shame is not real. It's just a thing. It's not...
It's your head. It's in your head.
And it causes so many problems, right?
Yeah.
Because it keeps people from doing the things they want to do, and feeling the way they want to feel, and, like it did with me for a really long time.
Right. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Of course. And that's the way our society is set up, right?
Absolutely.
To like
Absolutely.
put us in those places.
Right.
The title of the book, I know it came from a poem, that your mother wrote. Does it have other, like, why did you choose that, I guess, is where it comes out of?
Well, the initial title was, there were two other titles. Destination Unknown was the first title, which I think would still apply.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Sure.
The second one was The Cherry Tree, which is the title of the poem.
Right.
And then I was driving down the street one day, and this popped into my head, and that's how I knew that it was right, because that's kind of how everything has been in my life. Whatever's next in front of me and whatever feels the best, and but the fruit I'm experiencing right now, and not just her kids, because in that poem she says, I'm planting this cherry tree for Chrissy, Gail, and Phil, for her kids, but now I get to share that with the world. That brief period of recovery, because I talked about how I have this credibility because I'm a lawyer, right? So that was one thing. But then her period of recovery it was like maybe a year and a half that she was clean before she died. Out of my whole life, she was a heroin addict, so she was not available or whatever. I'm actually going to read a portion, that's the part I picked, about her, in that, her being active. But she wasn't able to be a mother my whole life. So this one period of time changed everything for me, because during that period of time I was able to not stop resenting her, to stop feeling that anger, to stop feeling like it was my fault. You know, there were things that happened that, to hear her story about the 3 rooms inside of her, which, that's a book, so that's coming at some point in time. There'll be a whole bunch more about that. So these little things aren't so little. You know, this fruit, it wasn't so little at all, and that's where the title comes in.
All right, that's fascinating too. Yeah, I was interested because it's very complicated. Like everybody always has complicated relationships, right, with their parents, of course, and you're no exception.
Right.
And I think it's very interesting, you know, with your mother, because this is the only parent, your only active parent, your constant parent that you actually have, besides your grandparent, right? That your or little Nana. But you know, do you have just forgiveness for your mother now at this point, or do you, like, how do you feel about your mother now after all of that? Because I know during, obviously, I'm not spoil, but it makes sense. I mean, of course, like if you have a parent who's addicted to heroin and you can't depend on her, right? You've never were able to depend on her, and that's like a running theme, right, throughout your book, and really sets you up in, you don't have a role model, right, that you're looking up to as far as an adult woman,
right,
for your whole life. And so how do you feel about your mother now, looking back with the experience that you have and, you know, the growth that you've had since her passing?
Oh, I have nothing but love for my mother, and that was one of the reasons that year and a half was so important before she died. But I honestly would not change a thing,
really,
in my history, and I write that when I sign, because I can't say. And at the beginning of this talk, I said that, you know, I don't like to think about what would have been, you know, what might have been if my life had been different, but this is what I'm here for. You know, this is my purpose in the world, and I know this because I feel it. I mean, we do. We feel when we know what's right. You know, what's right is right. And this is, I wouldn't have this story otherwise. You know, I wouldn't have this. Right. So, I mean, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of what other people have to say, and that's where I get my inspiration from their histories, from their lives, from their experience. You know, I can't.
Right.
So my mother is part of that. If that had been any different, you know, of course I could, if I wanted to ruminate, I could say, you know, I wish I had a mother who was, because I see sometimes people with their kids, and, you know, I put myself in that kid position and wish that could, you know, but that's not helpful or useful. And
right, because you can't change the past.
Well, and again, nor would I, you know, because this is my life. This is.
So you've gotten to a place which is lovely, right, of that, you know, you are comfortable with.
Yes.
Your past and everything, so you're not looking back with regret at any time anymore, which is good. I was just interested too a little bit in, as far as your memoir process goes. I always wonder this just in general when I read memoirs, and I know the same for myself, right? If I'm looking back at a memory I have from my childhood, and certain parts of it, like, you know, things will stand out and you remember things word for word, and then other pieces are fuzzy, right? Like, what did I have for breakfast yesterday? Like, I don't know, right? Did you like interview like your sister or like anything like that to, like, if you're trying to clarify something that happened, or do you just like go with your memory?
No, my sister actually doesn't remember very much.
Oh, interesting.
We have a completely different experience with memories. Not with things that we remember. I mean, the gist is the same, but we also were separated very young.
Right. Yeah,
so
true,
she had her life. But I did journal a lot when I was young. I journaled, you know, I did. It was kind of, it was just kind of my way of making sense of things, you know, to write things down. And then I also have like bits and pieces of things, like, ironically, just like when I was at living at Camp Annisquam, like I wasn't sure when that was, and I found this card. I did this swim test in the pool there, and it has the date on it. You know, like when I flew back from Texas after I ran away, like, so, and I'm not giving away a lot of this book because there's a whole bunch. I found something that my mother had written down about the flight that was coming in, even though I didn't go to her when I got back. Stuff like that. So I had these ways of piecing things together. And then somebody had asked me, you know, how do you remember all of that? Like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, type of thing. But trauma has a way of, you know, so those are the things that I do remember. I don't remember the peaceful, calm days, if there were any. I mean, I'm sure there must have been. But that's why, because, you know, trauma is just that.
Yeah, all right, very good. Well, I think we're going to take a break to have you read.
Okay.
So if you want to read a little bit. So Gail is going to read a little bit from her book.
Sure. Chapter 17, Ape Arms, 1984. Turns out my mother is homeless too. She showed up at Little Nana's looking for a place to crash a few days after I did. That was a week ago. I thought it was Aunt Julie coming up the stairs, but my mother's face appeared in the doorway. It had been close to 2 months since the last time we spoke. "Hi," she said, smiling, politely, moving past me through the living room with the grace of a dancer, so light on her feet she could have been a ghost. She stopped only to pull a cigarette from Little Nana's pack on the coffee table, and then disappeared around the corner into the kitchen before closing the bathroom door. Little Nana and I didn't speak or even look at each other. It happened so quickly, for a moment, I wasn't sure it happened at all. I waited. She didn't return to the living room after the bathroom door opened. The only sound in the apartment came from the TV. I hesitated before getting out of my chair. This was new territory. She was lying on her back in the bedroom with her arms straight by her sides. Her eyes were closed and her body still. I stood in the doorway and watched for the rise and fall of her chest. When she moved her hand, I released the breath I didn't realize I was holding. I wanted to lie next to her, tell her how much I missed her and that I was sorry for running away, but she obviously hadn't come for me. My anger pushed me to hurl words at her instead. "I thought you'd be in a program by now." "Nope, not this time." She didn't open her eyes. Why not? Why bother? Her answers were short, barbed. "What about Chrissy and Philip?" "They're better off where they are. I just can't do it anymore." "What happened to Walter?" "No idea." "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't know, Gail. I'm doing the best I can. I'll get a place soon." She won't get clean without the usual post-eviction detox or stay clean without a halfway house. I knew her last statement was my cue to leave, but instead I kept my back pressed against the door frame, trying to figure out how to talk to her without sounding angry. I know my attitude pushes her away. After a moment, she opened her eyes and craned her neck to look in my direction. I was nearly behind her. "We'll talk later," she said. "I have a migraine. Will you shut off the light and close the door?" I think that's good for now.
All right. So why did you choose that section to read?
It's what we were talking about anyway with respect to my mother, but I just think it was a good representation of just kind of the way things were. You know, that was my experience for much of my life. And, you know, that internalization of there's something wrong with me, like I was trying to communicate and it wasn't received, you know, and that's the world of addiction. You know, I didn't have teachers, and without getting on a soapbox, that's why, you know, why I'm in this field of recovery, not monetarily, but because it's still such an issue. You know, there is still so many, probably more so now than ever, and people,
yes,
people die more often than they did back then from overdose and addiction. And
yeah, the opioids have really kicked things into a worse place. And I do think, you know, if any work that you're doing towards recovery and helping people is, you know, so valuable, because this is a real big problem.
It really
you know,
is.
And it's not going away. And as you say, like with the piece, you know, you talk about with shame,
right.
you know, like it's one of those things that you get trained to look away from, right? You look away from people with addiction, or you look away.
People with addiction try to look away from it,
right?
You know, from their own shame, because that's what
Yeah.
I did. But it doesn't. It's always there. I don't know if I heard it, but I've said it many times that guilt is when we feel bad about something we did, and shame is when we feel bad about who we are. You know, and that's kind of. It feels inherent, you know. It feels like something that we have ingrained and that we're born with, but it's not.
Right, right. And that there's something wrong with you that's keeping you in this place and doing these
Exactly.
things. And you know why? As your mother says, I think that's a good line there. She's like, why try?
Why bother?
You know,
right.
why bother? Because I'm just gonna go through the cycle again.
Exactly.
Like why not feel good? You know, while I can, or.
Yep.
You know,
and this is just life, and life is that way for people like us, and you know, and her mother felt that way, and her mother felt that way. You know, it's kind of like this is where we are, this is who we are, and it's just not true. It's just not true.
Right, it's just not true. Right, yeah. The you're not made to be a certain thing, and I think that's very hard. And so you said you're working on another book.
I am.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
It's not The Third Room. That one's coming. That's kind of a self-help type of book, but the next one is really kind of the next in time to The Fruit You'll Never See, and I haven't named it yet. So it's kind of like a sequel, although because this ends when I'm just beginning to practice law,
right?
Pretty much, and a lot happened after that, recovery-wise, for me.
For you,
right.
Okay. Oh, so good. So it'll be a little bit more about your recovery. Do you have a estimated when that'll be out?
I'm hoping within the year.
Wow.
Yeah. So this book was less about how to recover and more just the kind of that I did. So the next one is really my recovery process and you know how that happened.
All right. Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to reading the sequel to that. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, and for being our first guest.
Thank you for having
me.
Wonderful.
You're wonderful. And everybody, if you want to read The Fruit You'll Never See, it is available. It's out there, or at your local library.
It's available everywhere.
And I'll ask my last question that I like to, do you have a library card?
I do.
Oh,
I
very
do.
Good.
I don't get to the library very often, but I have a card.
You have a library card. Are you reading anything right now?
Oh, I read so much. I do. I am. I'm reading. What am I reading this very moment? Well, I'm listening to a lot of podcasts at the moment, but I'm reading a lot on, you know, publicity and like doing different
marketing
things. So
and
exactly,
things like that
right.
Right. So that's where you are right
Yeah.
now. All right, very good. Thank you so much, and thank you all for tuning in to A Novel Idea. I hope you'll come and watch us again, and we'll see you again next time on A Novel Idea. Thank you.